Hello, and welcome to an overview of the Application Lifecycle Management session that we're going to be delivering on February 15th. Quick agenda that we're going to cover in the session is some introductions and purpose for the session. Then we're going to talk about provisioning of SharePoint farms, Agile, continuous integration, automated testing, and lastly, change management. Quick intro, my name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a virtual technical specialist with Microsoft Canada. The reason we're giving this talk is to answer some of these questions, like how do we build a solid SharePoint development environment for the enterprise? Or how do a number of developers work together on a SharePoint project? How does code and content move through a dev, test, and production lifecycle? And what is Agile and continuous integration, and why is it important? First thing in building an enterprise environment for SharePoint development is how we provision the SharePoint farms. We're going to be building and tearing down a lot of different farms for our dev, our test, our production environments. We want a quick and easy way of doing that. We're going to leverage System Center Virtual Machine Manager and a great Codeplex project called AutoSP Installer, all running on top of Hyper-V images to be able to quickly spin up and create our images that we're going to need for our different SharePoint farms. We'll also talk about Agile in a SharePoint context, where a development team works closely with the product owner, typically in 2-week-long sprints, to define, build, document, and test potentially shippable product increments in an iterative process. We'll look at how we integrate that in with Team Foundation Server, and in particular how we use an add-on product called Urban Turtle to help manage the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the burn down, the artifacts around an Agile process. Then we'll get into continuous integration. How do we get our developers working in Visual Studio, deploying their artifacts into Team Foundation Server, and then using continuous integration and build processes to build and deploy that to our SharePoint environments? And then how do we exercise that environment with automated testing? We'll dive deeper down into Team Foundation Server, talk about how we create a build server and configure it in order to do the automated builds, the deployments to our dev integration box, and ultimately to kick off the automated tests against those. And also the automated testing tools, particularly the Telerik Test Studio that we're going to demonstrate and use in terms of doing some automated testing. Lastly, we'll talk about change management processes. How do developers working in their individual VMs check their code into a common TFS repository and then deploy that code out to a dev integration server as part of continuous integration? And also, how do we take content written by content authors in a master site and merge that into that dev integration? Once we've gone through the initial integration testing, how do we repeat that process into a QA environment and then ultimately into a production environment? Once the site goes live, though, the master site goes away, and how do we move that content that's now being authored in the production environment back into our QA and our dev integration environments? So if you're interested, I encourage you to register for the event, either downtown at the Toronto SharePoint Users Group at meetup.com/TorontoSPUG, or for the Mississauga event at the www.envisionit.com/events site. And as always, you can find the follow-on presentation materials on my blog site at blog.petercarson.ca.